In 2012, a tourist vanished inside Yosemite National Park without any clear explanation, and at first, no one treated it as anything more than a routine delay. The park had seen thousands of visitors that year, many of them solo travelers who came and went without much notice, so when a man in his mid-30s failed to return from a hike, lodge staff assumed he had simply stayed out longer than planned. He had checked in 2 days earlier, paid in cash, and told the front desk he intended to explore a few popular trails before heading north. He didn't mention caves, off-trail routes, or anything that would immediately suggest risk. On the morning he disappeared, he was seen near a trailhead shortly after sunrise, carrying a standard hiking backpack, dressed appropriately for the weather, and asking a ranger whether recent snowmelt had made any sections dangerous. He was advised to stick to marked paths and avoid rocky shortcuts. He acknowledged the warning, thanked her, and walked away. That was the last confirmed sighting. When he failed to return that night, no alarm was raised. By the next afternoon, concern began to build. By the second night, rangers were notified and a formal search began. Search teams moved through the area methodically, starting with the trails he was most likely to have taken. Dogs picked up a scent near the trailhead but lost it not far in, as if he had either doubled back or moved onto terrain where scent couldn't carry. Helicopters scanned open areas, cliff edges, and riverbanks. Volunteers checked ravines and dense tree lines where injured hikers sometimes crawl for shelter. Nothing turned up. No dropped gear, no clothing, no signs of a fall, no evidence he had entered the water. His car was parked exactly where it should have been. His phone was never recovered, and there were no outgoing calls after the morning he disappeared. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded, then slowly scaled back as resources were redirected to more active cases. Eventually, the disappearance was classified as unresolved, with the official assumption being that he had suffered an accident in an untracked area and that nature had done what it often does in the park: erase evidence. Still, some details didn't sit right. He was not inexperienced. His backpack, according to the receipt found at the lodge, contained proper supplies. He had told staff he planned short hikes, not overnight trips. And most unusual of all, no remains were found even after years passed and hikers continued to explore the same regions. 3 years later, in the fall of 2015, a hiker entered a quieter section of the park, one that wasn't restricted but rarely mentioned because it lacked dramatic views and was considered unremarkable. He wasn't searching for anything specific. He had taken the day to walk slowly, moving off the main trail only slightly to avoid crowds. Late in the afternoon, he noticed something that didn't fit the landscape: stones stacked deliberately near a low rock formation. At first, he assumed it was a crude trail marker or the remains of a campfire structure. But the arrangement was too precise, and there was no ash or burn marks. Curious, he followed the stones and noticed a shallow cave opening partially concealed by brush and shadow. It wasn't large, and it didn't appear on his map. He hesitated, aware that caves in Yosemite are discouraged due to unstable rock and limited visibility. Then he saw part of a strap near the entrance, faded but unmistakably man-made. He moved closer, brushed aside a few stones, and shined his headlamp inside. The cave was small but dry, with a flat area near the back where something had been placed intentionally. There, surrounded by more stacked stones, sat a backpack. It wasn't buried, it wasn't damaged beyond normal wear. It looked as though someone had set it down carefully and arranged the stones around it afterward. The hiker didn't open it. Something about the placement felt deliberate enough to make him uneasy. He backed out, took photos of the cave and the bag, marked his GPS location, and left the area. Once he had cell service, he contacted park authorities and reported exactly what he had seen. Rangers arrived the next morning and quietly secured the area without drawing attention. The backpack was removed and taken for examination. Inside were personal items consistent with a day hike: a water bottle, an outdated trail map, a jacket, and a wallet. The identification inside confirmed what no one had expected. The bag belonged to the tourist who had vanished 3 years earlier. That discovery immediately raised questions that the original investigation had never answered. Why was the bag placed in a cave he hadn't mentioned visiting? Why was it surrounded by stones, as if marked or concealed? And if the backpack had been there since 2012, why had it gone unnoticed for so long in an area that, while quiet, wasn't completely untouched? The case, long considered dormant, was reopened. Investigators now had physical evidence that suggested intentional placement rather than accident, and for the first time since the disappearance, the possibility that the tourist hadn't simply gotten lost felt uncomfortably real. Once the backpack was confirmed to belong to the missing tourist, investigators reopened the case quietly, aware that public attention could quickly turn speculation into distraction. The location of the cave inside Yosemite National Park immediately complicated matters because it did not align with any trail the man had said he intended to hike, nor did it match the areas originally searched most heavily in 2012. Rangers returned to the original logs, interviews, and reports, piecing together the timeline with fresh eyes. The tourist had not purchased cave exploration permits, had not asked questions about geological formations, and had not carried specialized equipment that would suggest intentional cave entry. That raised the first serious concern: how did he end up there at all? The cave itself was shallow and stable, not a place someone would accidentally stumble into while hiking, especially given its partially concealed entrance and the deliberate stone placement around it. The stones became a focal point. Park geologists confirmed they were not the result of erosion or animal activity. They had been placed by human hands, intentionally, and with enough care to suggest purpose rather than casual stacking. Inside the backpack, items were cataloged carefully. Nothing appeared damaged by water, and there was no evidence of long-term exposure to extreme weather, which suggested the cave had remained dry and protected. The map inside was folded and marked with light pencil notes, none of which indicated off-trail exploration or caves. There were no journal entries, no written explanations, and no signs of panic. His wallet contained cash that had not been disturbed. If robbery had been a motive, it made no sense. Forensic analysis of the bag revealed trace amounts of dirt consistent with the cave floor, but also faint residue that did not match that location, implying the bag may have been moved before being placed there. That detail unsettled investigators because it suggested the backpack had not simply been left behind at the time of disappearance. Attention turned back to the original search radius. In 2012, teams had focused heavily on areas near cliffs and water sources, operating under the assumption of a fall or accidental injury. The cave area had been visually scanned from the outside, but never entered because nothing at the time suggested it was relevant. The hiker who discovered the bag later stated that if not for the stacked stones and visible strap, he would have walked past it without a second thought. That raised the uncomfortable possibility that the placement of the stones was intentional not just to hide the bag, but also to mark it for someone who knew where to look. Investigators began asking a question that hadn't been seriously considered before. Was the tourist alone when he disappeared? Interviews were conducted again with lodge staff, rangers, and nearby visitors who had been in the park that week. Most memories had faded, but one detail resurfaced. A seasonal employee recalled seeing the tourist speaking with another man near a rest area on the morning he disappeared. At the time, it seemed insignificant. 2 hikers talking was common, but now the description mattered. The employee couldn't remember a face, only that the other man appeared familiar with the park and was pointing at a map. That interaction had never been recorded in the original report because it hadn't seemed relevant. Phone records were re-examined. While the tourist's phone was never recovered, metadata from nearby towers showed his signal moving briefly in a direction inconsistent with the trail he had mentioned. It wasn't enough to pinpoint a location, but it supported the theory that he changed course that morning. Investigators also examined missing persons cases from surrounding years, looking for patterns. None matched closely enough to suggest a serial offender, but several unresolved disappearances involved hikers being redirected by someone offering guidance or shortcuts. That possibility forced a re-evaluation of assumptions. The cave itself was examined thoroughly. No remains were found, no blood, no personal items beyond the backpack. But the floor showed subtle disturbances beneath a layer of dust, suggesting that something heavy may have rested there temporarily before being removed. The cave was not a natural endpoint, it was a stop. That realization shifted the case from misadventure to potential foul play. Investigators faced a difficult question. If someone else had been involved, how had they avoided detection in one of the most monitored national parks in the country? The answer lay partly in timing. The disappearance occurred during a peak season when thousands of visitors moved through the park daily. Blending in would have been easy. Rangers also acknowledged that backcountry areas, while regulated, cannot be constantly monitored. A person with knowledge of the terrain could move unnoticed, especially if they appeared to be just another hiker. The reopening of the case triggered internal debate about whether the public should be informed immediately. Ultimately, officials chose discretion, fearing that speculation could lead to false sightings or damage to sensitive areas. Instead, they focused on reconstructing the hours leading up to the disappearance and understanding why the backpack was placed where it was. The stones, once thought to be a simple marker, now appeared more symbolic, either a signal, a warning, or an attempt to preserve something meant to be found later. As weeks passed, investigators realized that the cave discovery had not answered the mystery, it had widened it. The tourist had not vanished into the wilderness, he had been redirected, his belongings handled with care, and his trail deliberately obscured. The question was no longer how he got lost, but who had guided him there, and why. As investigators continued rebuilding the case, attention shifted away from the cave itself and toward the human movements that may have surrounded the disappearance inside Yosemite National Park, because the evidence now suggested planning rather than chance. Rangers began mapping foot traffic patterns from the week the tourist vanished, cross-referencing campground permits, parking logs, and trailhead sign-in sheets, even though many were incomplete or handwritten. While no name immediately stood out, analysts noticed something subtle but troubling. Several individuals had entered the park that week without registering overnight stays and had remained inside longer than expected for day hikers. This wasn't illegal, but combined with the new theory, it became relevant. Investigators also revisited weather data from the day of the disappearance and confirmed conditions had been stable, eliminating sudden storms or environmental triggers that might have forced a change in route. That reinforced the idea that the tourist's deviation from his planned trail was intentional. Interviews expanded beyond park staff to include frequent hikers and informal guides who often spent entire seasons in the park, living out of vans or temporary housing nearby. One name surfaced repeatedly in unrelated conversations, not as a suspect, but as a familiar presence. A man known for offering advice to tourists, sometimes walking portions of trails with them before heading off in another direction. He was described as knowledgeable, quiet, and friendly, someone who appeared trustworthy simply because he belonged to the landscape. When investigators located him, he cooperated fully, acknowledging that he often spoke with visitors and shared route suggestions, but denied any involvement with the missing tourist. His timeline placed him in the park that morning, though not near the cave area, and there was no evidence to contradict his statement. Still, the interaction described by the seasonal employee lingered in investigators' minds. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued analyzing the backpack. Microscopic fibers found on the straps did not match the clothing the tourist had been last seen wearing, indicating that someone else may have handled it while wearing different materials. These fibers were common enough to be inconclusive, but they supported the idea of third-party contact. More revealing was the condition of the items inside. The jacket showed folding creases inconsistent with being worn and discarded, suggesting it had been packed neatly before being placed in the cave. The water bottle was empty but clean, with no signs of long-term stagnation. Everything pointed to deliberate placement rather than abandonment in distress. Investigators then examined the stones more closely. Some bore faint tool marks, not enough to identify a specific instrument, but enough to show they had been adjusted rather than naturally stacked. This raised a new possibility. The stones were not meant to conceal the bag permanently, but to mark the location for later retrieval. If so, why was it never retrieved? One theory proposed that something had gone wrong after the bag was placed there, disrupting a plan that was never completed. That led to an uncomfortable line of inquiry. Was the tourist still alive after entering the cave? To explore this, investigators looked for signs of movement beyond that point. The surrounding terrain was searched again, this time with ground-penetrating radar in select areas where the soil allowed it. Nothing was found. However, farther from the cave, in a narrow corridor between rock formations, searchers discovered disturbed earth consistent with foot traffic that had not been present during earlier searches. It wasn't enough to confirm a burial or struggle, but it suggested movement away from the cave rather than toward danger zones like cliffs or water. At this stage, the case began to resemble other incidents where individuals were lured off established paths under the guise of shortcuts or scenic detours. Investigators were careful not to draw conclusions without evidence, but the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. The tourist had asked for information. He had been open to guidance. He had changed direction. His belongings had been preserved, and his trail had been intentionally obscured. Records from nearby towns were examined, including hospital admissions, arrests, and unusual activity reported in the days following the disappearance. Nothing directly linked back to him, but one report stood out. A minor altercation reported by a shop owner involving a man who appeared disoriented and injured, refusing help and leaving abruptly. The description was vague and the date uncertain, but it introduced the possibility that the tourist may have survived the initial encounter and moved beyond the park boundaries. Investigators debated this theory heavily. If he had left the park alive, why had no confirmed sightings emerged in the years since? Why leave behind identification and money? The absence of answers forced investigators to confront the limitations of the evidence. The cave offered clarity, but not resolution. It confirmed that the disappearance was not a simple accident, but it did not reveal motive or outcome. As months passed, the reopened investigation faced growing pressure to produce results, yet every lead dissolved into uncertainty. The final realization of this phase of the case was sobering. The tourist's disappearance was not the result of one dramatic event, but a sequence of quiet decisions and unseen interactions. The park had not swallowed him whole. Someone, somewhere, had intervened, altered his path, and erased his presence with patience rather than force. And until that person or mistake was identified, the truth would remain just beyond reach. By the time the investigation entered its fourth phase, officials accepted that the case would not be solved through traditional search methods alone, and attention turned toward understanding intent rather than location inside Yosemite National Park. The backpack, once treated as a static clue, became central again as analysts reconsidered what it represented. If it had been marked for retrieval, then whoever placed it there expected to return, which meant something had disrupted that plan. Investigators began exploring the idea that the disappearance may have involved an informal arrangement rather than overt violence, possibly an agreement that escalated beyond control. This reframing led them to examine economic and social factors tied to the park during that period. Seasonal work, under-the-table guiding, and unofficial trail services were more common in 2012 than the park publicly acknowledged, and while most were harmless, they created opportunities for unrecorded interactions. Financial records tied to the tourist were reviewed again, this time looking beyond bank activity to travel history, cash withdrawals, and communications leading up to the trip. He had withdrawn a modest amount of cash shortly before arriving, but nothing suggesting desperation or secrecy. His emails, recovered from cloud backups, showed no sign of planning anything beyond a vacation. There were no hidden contacts, no coded messages, no indication that he expected to meet someone. This reinforced the belief that whatever happened was spontaneous rather than premeditated on his part. Investigators then examined ranger schedules and patrol routes from the day of the disappearance. A gap emerged, an area that received minimal coverage during a specific 2-hour window due to staff reassignment for a medical emergency elsewhere in the park. Coincidentally, this window aligned with the time his phone signal shifted direction. That gap did not prove wrongdoing, but it highlighted how easily someone could move undetected during peak season if they knew patrol rhythms. Attention returned to individuals who regularly spent time in those less monitored zones. One former seasonal worker, no longer employed by the park, came under quiet scrutiny due to inconsistencies in his recollection of that summer. He had not been on duty the day of the disappearance, but was known to hike extensively in off-trail areas. When questioned years later, his memories conflicted with earlier statements he had made during a separate inquiry. None of this rose to the level of evidence, but it contributed to a growing profile of opportunity rather than accusation. Meanwhile, environmental analysts reassessed the cave location and its surroundings. They concluded that while the cave was not a destination, it was ideally positioned as a temporary holding point, close enough to trails to reach easily, but far enough to remain unnoticed. The stones, once thought symbolic, were now interpreted as practical markers visible only to someone approaching from a specific direction. This supported the theory that the cave was part of a route rather than an endpoint. Investigators considered whether the tourist had been persuaded to leave his belongings behind voluntarily, perhaps under the belief he would retrieve them shortly. That would explain the careful placement and absence of damage. It also suggested trust. This was not someone fleeing danger, it was someone following instruction. As this interpretation took hold, the case became less about physical evidence and more about psychology. Why would a cautious adult follow a stranger off-trail? The answer likely lay in context, authority, familiarity, or the promise of something benign, such as a shortcut or scenic view. Interviews with hikers who had visited the park around that time revealed that informal guidance was common, especially when offered by someone who appeared experienced. Several recalled being led briefly off marked paths without incident. This normalized behavior blurred the line between safe and unsafe decisions. Investigators also revisited the decision not to publicize the cave discovery immediately. While discretion had preserved the integrity of the site, it may have delayed crucial tips. Eventually, limited details were released to the public, carefully framed to avoid sensationalism. The response was muted, but not non-existent. A handful of tips came in, most vague or speculative, but one stood out. A caller reported overhearing a conversation years earlier between two men discussing a bag left behind and a problem that fixed itself. The memory was uncertain, the details thin, and the timing unclear, but it aligned uncomfortably well with existing theories. Investigators followed the lead cautiously, unable to corroborate it directly. As the months passed, momentum slowed. The case had reached a point where evidence suggested involvement but resisted confirmation. The park, vast and indifferent, held its silence. Officials prepared for the possibility that no definitive resolution would ever emerge. Yet internally, there was consensus on one point: the disappearance was not an accident, and the cave was not a coincidence. The tourist's path had been altered by human influence, subtle enough to escape notice, deliberate enough to leave behind a trace. Whether through manipulation, misplaced trust, or circumstance, he had stepped into a situation he could not step out of. And somewhere beyond the stones and shadows, the truth remained buried, not by nature, but by choices made in moments no one thought to record. As the investigation entered its final stage, officials accepted that the case would likely never reach the kind of resolution people expect from disappearances, but that did not stop them from documenting what could be responsibly concluded about what happened inside Yosemite National Park. By this point, the evidence painted a quiet but coherent picture rather than a dramatic one. The tourist had not wandered aimlessly, nor had he suffered an obvious accident. He had altered his route deliberately, likely after interacting with someone he believed to be knowledgeable or trustworthy. That decision, small and reasonable in the moment, set off a chain of events that removed him from visible paths and official oversight. The cave, now fully understood, was never meant to hide a body or serve as a final location. It functioned as a pause, a place where belongings could be left behind without damage or suspicion, suggesting that the tourist expected to return shortly. Investigators concluded that he most likely entered the cave willingly, placed his backpack where instructed, and followed someone onward, unburdened and unaware that this separation would become permanent. What happened after remains uncertain, but no evidence supported a violent struggle at or near the cave. This absence of violence did not rule out harm, it suggested something more controlled, more situational. The theory that gained quiet acceptance was that the tourist encountered a situation that escalated unexpectedly, an injury, a confrontation, or a circumstance that prevented him from returning to the cave. The person involved, if there was one, may not have planned harm but responded to it in a way that prioritized concealment over help. That would explain the careful handling of the backpack and the lack of theft or damage. It would also explain why the bag was never retrieved. Whatever plan existed ended abruptly. Investigators explored the possibility that the tourist died elsewhere and that his remains were lost to terrain beyond practical recovery, a common outcome in rugged wilderness. This theory, while unsatisfying, aligned with the absence of physical evidence despite renewed searches. As time passed, leads grew colder, witnesses moved away, and memories softened into uncertainty. The park itself changed. Trails shifted, vegetation grew, and the cave blended further into the landscape. Eventually, officials prepared a final internal report summarizing the findings. It stated clearly that the disappearance could not be attributed to environmental accident alone, and that human involvement, whether intentional or negligent, was the most plausible explanation. However, without direct evidence or remains, the case could not be formally classified as a crime. It remained unresolved, suspended between categories. The family was informed of the conclusions with care. They were told that their loved one had not simply vanished into nothing, that his final movements had purpose, even if that purpose was shaped by misplaced trust. The discovery of the backpack, though painful, provided confirmation that he had survived beyond the point where he was last seen, and that his disappearance followed a narrative rather than chaos. For some, that knowledge offered a form of closure. For others, it reopened wounds that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, the cave was quietly documented and then left undisturbed. No signs were posted, no warnings added. Officials understood that public fascination could turn such places into destinations, and the last thing they wanted was to invite speculation into a site already burdened with unanswered questions. The hiker who discovered the bag was never publicly identified and returned to the park only once afterward, avoiding that section entirely. He later described the discovery not as frightening, but unsettling in a slow, lingering way, the kind that stays with you long after the moment passes. Today, the case exists as a reminder of how disappearances in vast landscapes rarely involve dramatic endings. More often, they are the result of ordinary decisions intersecting with unfamiliar environments and unrecorded human interactions. The tourist did not make reckless choices. He did not seek danger. He trusted the wrong moment, the wrong direction, or the wrong person. His story remains unfinished not because of mystery alone, but because nature and time are skilled at dissolving answers. Inside the park, thousands of visitors continue to walk past places where lives quietly diverged from expectation, unaware that the ground beneath them once marked the last known path of someone who never meant to disappear. And in that silence, the truth remains intact but unreachable, preserved not by secrecy, but by the simple fact that some moments, once missed, can never be recovered.